long way. Sir, maybe you'd like to say a few words.
Say a few words from behind you.
I figure you would never be at a loss for words.
Well, no, I'm not often at a loss for words, I have to say. David Triggs from the International Union for Land Value Taxation and Free Trade, based in the UK, or originating in the UK in that sense, with the Henry George Foundation of Great Britain. So that's, in a sense, where I'm coming from. I guess I could just introduce you to how I came across the Henry George teachings, which was through in London at the age of 20. I'm now 76, so a little while ago. And in that context, it was originating through the study of philosophy. The School of Economic Science in London, which was formed in 1937, was centred upon the teachings of Henry George, and in particular emphasising the importance of understanding natural law, or the laws of nature. And the school persevered with that single approach through to the early 50s, and following that really discovered that if it wants to know more about the nature of society and relations between men in society, it needs to understand a little more about the nature of man. And so the study of philosophy, as it were, grew out of the study of economics, and that's been, for me, the probably single most important thing to know. And as a profession, I was a civil engineer, specialising in water and public water supplies, sewage treatment, and the like. And serving for a long time, first of all, providing public water supplies and sewage treatment within the London and then the Greater Thames area, so the larger populace of the UK in that context. And then for the last 20 years of my working life was spent largely internationally, working for much of the time in India, Bangladesh, various parts of Africa, the Yemen, and surrounding. But linking that, and for me, the two marry very beautifully, insofar as any engineer has to first of all understand the laws of nature. In my case, it's understanding something about the law of gravity. Water runs downhill. And simply bearing such a simple thing in mind is really rather important in terms of devising solutions to problems in that particular area. So both my professional life and my interest life, if I can put it that way, revolved around that. So my master's degree was in public health engineering. I then also did a master's in business administration as a mature student, sort of in my 40s, and so rose to senior management positions within Thames Water before embarking upon a career as an independent consultant, management consultant. And what I actually came to appreciate, and maybe I can just put this in some perspective because it relates to the experience that we're now having in Baltimore, which is to attempt to apply a theory to a practical situation. And of course that's the link for me there is, I could go back to 1970 in relation to water, if I may. I was building, as a civil engineer, construction. I'd been involved in the design and was now on site supervising construction of a new sewage treatment works, or extensions to the sewage treatment works, when there arose a strike, the Dirty Workers' Strike of 1970. And in that context, throughout London and the like, refuse wasn't being collected and all sorts of things were going wrong. But one of the things that happened at that time was that the sewage workers were going on strike. And the particular area that I've been concerned with on site had been the inlet works. And the inlet works is probably the dirtiest part of sewage treatment, insofar as it involves raking the screens. Sewage comes in to a pumping station, is lifted and passes on. But in terms of what I discovered was that, and what I knew now from the work that I'm doing, that if the screens weren't cleared at Deepham sewage treatment works, we were going to be flooding the basements of properties in Tottenham. That isn't what I went into the business for. So I found myself organising a scab labour force to keep the screens running at Deepham sewage treatment works, to prevent, not to break the strike, but to ensure that there was that we didn't flood houses, basically, with sewage. Now the experience then got me into operations, and what I discovered was that the designs that I'd been involved in and that others and that were traditional weren't really amenable to the work of operations. And so I concluded it's a bit like designing a car and you've never driven. What I discovered is it's really rather important, the operational side of things, if you ever want to be a decent designer. So my emphasis then switched from capital works, design, construction, build, to operations, to the operation of facilities. At least I convinced myself that I'm not going to go back to design until I know how to operate these things. So that took my career in the direction of operational management, sewage works managers and the like. But it really highlighted the need for practical experience in applying the theory. So that's how I'm, as it were, making a bridge. Just at this point, you've asked me to speak about myself, and that's a bridge for me here, as to appreciate the value of looking practically, well, what could you do in Baltimore? I'd love to know. Because, I mean, that's a really practical situation where you've got a problem, you've got a body of people and a body of knowledge of that's required to address that issue, but how do you actually do it? So that's probably enough for me for the moment, just to put in context how it is that I'm here and why it is that I value looking at this particularly practical problem, much as I love the theory and the ethical basis upon which the theory is, upon which obviously we'll hear about later in the week.
Tell us your name, please.
Sorry, the name is David Spriggs.
David, when you were in Yemen, was the war going on there?
When I was in war in Yemen, no, the war wasn't going on, but I could see it coming. If I may just briefly refer here to abuse. I developed a system. In fact, I've talked about it at different points within these things, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to say something about it here again. But Yemen is one of those multitude of cities throughout the developing world where there's simply not enough water to go around. And so what that involves is the water supply is intermittent and broken. Now when again, you don't really know, you read all the data, you take the data on board, but what you really discover is when you're on site. And when I went to Yemen and then go out to see, well, where does the water come from that this city's being served? I was in Sana'a, so the capital city of Yemen. Where does the water come from that serves this city? And it's tube wells. And I went out to see a few tube wells, and I go out to these tube wells just outside the city, and when I get there I see some chaps with Kalashnikovs. What's that about? And they're all around, all armed things. And what I then discover is what's the water really being used for? Well, the water in Sana'a and around Sana'a in Yemen is used to grow cat, Q80, the drug. And so the cat barons controlled the water supply. So there wasn't, in that sense, an absolute scarcity of water. There was an exaggerated scarcity of water for public supplies because the whole system was corrupt. In a sense, one of the lessons that I learned from working internationally is you can have all the theories in the world and the technical solutions, but if the morality or the ethic itself has been corrupted, you can't go anywhere. So you've got to give the emphasis to getting an ethical basis first, before the technical solutions can possibly be entertained. So, in answer to your question, I'm sorry I rambled on around it to try and illustrate, is that no, the war wasn't there, but the injustice and the anger was evident that that was inevitable, because there was no government in control of a basic thing such as public water supply. And the Kalashnikovs were in charge, and they've remained in charge since. So I could see it coming. But, and you know, all I could do, I was working for the World Bank at that stage and writing reports about, well, what's going to get right. And of course what I had to say, but if you don't get this bit right, forget going to technical experts that are going to tell you how you could best organise the water supply industry.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. All right.
The far left never appreciated was that Adam Smith and John Locke were working for landowners. The Adam Smith's book was financed by the Duke of Buccleuch. The current Duke of Buccleuch is the largest landowner in Scotland. That Duke of Buccleuch was not the largest landowner, but he was making a fortune in banking. So Adam Smith was actually very good on land, not so good on money. But when you got to the United States, Ben Franklin was responding to somebody who had written to him about land value tax, and he said all of our legislators are landowners, and they are not. Well, the first thing he said is, I have not forgotten my political economy, but all of our legislators are landowners, and they are not.
I didn't know that.
What is political economy?
It wasn't in the letter, but the way he said it, it sounded like, well, everybody knows this. So,
I got the answer for you.
Okay. All right.
When he went to France, he said that the person he wanted to meet most was Francois Quesnay. And he said, I'm a physiocrat. He had read the physiocratic writings, and he admitted, he said, my religion is physiocracy. So that's the answer.
Okay. Thank you.
physiocracy, which is much better than mediocrity.
If I could go twice, somebody's got to mention the article in The Economist 2 weeks ago.
Well, all right. I have something to say about that. Well, wait a minute.
Well, he's twice.
We've got 5 minutes left, and you guys have both talked.
We've got
I'll let Polly go. One thing I did want to say while she's walking up here is that I have a cousin, first cousin, who's been the editor of Workers' World, the socialist newspaper, for decades. And every once in a while I ask her, what about the land tax? Now this is somebody who's lived most of her life in the city of New York and even in Manhattan. And she says, well, she says, you know, land was once a measure of one's wealth, but not anymore. So I was at a family reunion not long ago, and I asked her again, and she said the same thing. And then subsequently, I was talking to my sister, and she says, oh yeah. She says, you know, I was talking to her, and she says, I'm going to have to read Robbers in Poverty.
Well, I hear all the time the land is no longer relevant, and then I remind people who owns the land. Corporations, the wealthy these days own a lot of stocks and bonds, but ultimately those corporations get their income from owning land. I mean, and not just terra firma, but broadcast licenses, rights of way, oil drilling rights, you name it. So it's just that, and as I always say, corporations are a union of landowners, because I hear people, oh, you know, unions are terrible, labor unions. I said corporations are a union of landowners, and they are much more powerful than unions of working people. Anyway, I couldn't resist commenting. I see that this was in the packet, Why We Need Better Alternative to Land Value Taxation by Gerwin, unpronounceable. I don't know if he or she is here. Once again, there's this whole idea that, oh, if we have land value taxation, we can tax land values down to zero. Can't happen. Totally impossible, because you may be collecting the tax, but you are also spending it somewhere. And one would hope you are spending it on good infrastructure, on benefits to people, uniform UBI, uniform basic income, whatever. So you may be collecting it, but you're spending it, and spending it increases land values. So you cannot tax land down to zero or anything close, but the first effect is to increase land values in the central best located land and to decrease land values around the fringes. So that is the first impact of a switch to land value taxation. You cannot get rid of it. Only afterwards, the second effect is if you're doing land value taxation on a large enough region, I mean, forget, local town land value tax. On a large enough region, then you will drive up wages, and at least temporarily you will drive up interest rates, and that will lower land values. But until you are really seriously driving up wages, and maybe or maybe not interest, but wages, all you're doing is shifting the land values to the central areas and away from the fringe areas, which is certainly a good thing to happen, mind you, because you're shifting economic activity onto the most suitable land. But no way, tax land values down to zero or even close, no way, can't happen. Yeah.
Holly, do you mean price or do you mean rental value?
I mean price, land prices. Well, people say tax land values down to zero. Yeah.
Well, whoever the planning committee is, I can see this PowerPoint at our conference next year, so don't forget that. Well, as Dan was talking, I kept reassociating on you, and I was thinking about this nice little state of Delaware where I live, which if you are in the northern part of the state, you think you're a northern state, and if you're in the southern part of the state, you think of yourself as a southern state. And in 1899 is when they abolished the requirement that you had to be a landowner in order to vote. So that's, 2 years after George died. And then I think it was the next year that they ratified the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments to the Constitution. It's 1/4 after, so that's the end of this session, and thank you so much for coming.